Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us.
Going really well. It's been a busy, fun week, but the best part of it always, of course, is hanging out and talking comics with you. So I'm glad to be back. Yeah, 72 was an interesting year. It is a very important year for Marvel. Like, we're going to talk about a number of things that Marvel did this year and how Marvel really sort of controlled the narrative of comics in 1972. But there's a lot of really other interesting stuff going on out there too. So, a really, really fun year for comic books. All right. There you go. Excellent. We found that that's where I'm most useful to Dwayne as far as Marvel Snap, because it turns out I suck at this game, and I get frustrated at it, and I've given up, because it's really hard. When he says, I've gone infinite in 4 days, he's underestimating or understating just how ridiculously difficult that is to do, and how impossible it is for many of us. In case you don't play Snap, what Dwayne's doing is pretty impressive. It is the equivalent of basically hitting the highest level of competition in the game on a regular or pretty much constant basis.
The year in comics. All right, Dan, you said 1972 was a big, or at least a really interesting year for comics as a whole, not just Marvel. So tell us, what is going on in 1972 that's so interesting?
So first off, I could spend way more time than I have with the let's talk about a few things before getting to Daredevil format that we have. But 1972 was a year that we just gotten the Comics Code Authority revised in late 1971.
That's right.
And Marvel and DC and all these other companies are hiring a bunch of newer people, and some of their older folks are heading out to pasture, going out to take jobs at, big corporate design companies, or just retiring because they're in their 50s or 60s now and are moving on to different types of work. So there's so many new people and new ideas in the industry. And this is just a fantastically interesting year with all sorts of new things going on. So if we start over at the distinguished competition, DC's having a tough time. They've been bought out by a media conglomerate or an aspiring media conglomerate, and those corporate overlords have caused them to raise the prices on all their comics to 25 cents.
Okay.
And now will not let them bring their prices back down to 20 cents when Marvel does it. So they're stuck for the first part of the year in an unenviable position. And that is that they're trying to sell things at a much higher price than their competition, and it shows. So there's some problems that happen there for them. But in the midst of that, DC has also an explosion of creativity going on. They bring out so much new stuff this year. They bring out Jonah Hex, who's going to be sort of their primary Western superhero for the next however many decades. There's been a relatively terrible Jonah Hex movie came out even, but the tons of great comic books even in the last few years. They brought out Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing technically had premiered the year before. We talked about the Three Muck Monsters, but this is the year that Bernie Wrightson sort of attaches to him, and Swamp Thing becomes a comic book that basically is what everybody's talking about. It's absolutely a fantastic book. But again, not superhero. This is more like horror and human drama type of stuff.
Right.
We've got Commandy, which is a new Jack Kirby offering that's basically about a kid who is trapped in a post-apocalyptic future. Think Planet of the Apes, only with a probably 15-year-old boy instead of the, grown astronaut.
Okay.
You've got, I don't know, one of the kids from Stranger Things or something, right?
Sure.
And then instead of just having a bunch of gorillas, there's anthropomorphic animals of all sorts. You've got talking dogs and talking tigers and talking lions and everything else. Actually, a really great comic book. I loved Commandy when I was a kid. And interestingly, although so many people talk about and love DC's Fourth World, and it's kind of, brought us Darkseid and all this stuff that went forward in the Marvel Universe, or the DC Universe, Commandy was actually the best-selling title that Jack Kirby did for DC. And it went for 57 issues. He didn't stay on the whole time, but the title went for quite a while. While unfortunately, all of his Fourth World books, save one, were canceled this year without even making it a full year, simply because the sales were terrible. And in fact, Carmen Infantino, who is the publisher, is on record talking about the fact that they thought these books were groundbreaking. They thought they were going to sell like gangbusters and everybody was going to just be in love with them. And it turns out that there are a lot of fans who think that the Kirby work from 1972 is some of his best and most creative work ever. But the sales just didn't follow. And so, yeah. Go ahead.
Do you think it's just the price was the problem, or it just didn't land with the audience, or like they thought it would, or what do you think happened there?
So price didn't help. But I'm actually, the more we look at this, the more I'm starting to think that part of the problem is that as you get all of these young guys coming in, many of them have been reading comics their whole life, and they think of comics as an art form, and they want it to be more complex, and they want it to be more grown up, and for the stories to be better.
Okay.
But when it comes down to it, the comics that sell best are still the ones that kids pick up at the grocery store and just enjoy for fun. And I don't know how many 8-year-olds are going to get into not only buying the Fourth World comic books, but because there's 4 separate titles in an ongoing sort of massive, comic continuity.
Sure.
How many of them are going to try and follow that? So it was great for people who were the established fans, but especially in a world that was not, a place where there isn't really a direct market in effect yet. This was a market that I was reading that something like during the 70s, at one point, Richie Rich had 32 titles out every 2 months, which meant over the course of of a year, that would be like, I don't know how many issues. But so he averaged like 16 titles a month for a good part of it. During this year, Richie Rich put out 10 titles a month. In, Little Richie Rich, Richie Rich Millions, Richie Rich and Dot, or whatever. Richie Rich and Irona.
There's a lot of Richie Rich. Holy cow.
Yeah, if you take Richie Rich and Sad Sack, it's the equivalent in terms of comics published of the entire Marvel Universe output for the year.
Wow.
And so I think that part of the problem is that the goals of the people making comics and of the people who write comics history and are still thinking about comics now, and the goals and tastes of the people who needed to buy enough to keep it actually going were very different.
We're at odds with one another.
If you were one of those people who back in the early 2000s was like, how is it possible they canceled Arrested Development? It's the best show on television. Well, yeah, all 5 of us thought it was great, but unfortunately that was not enough to carry the tide because it didn't evidently resonate with the people who were sitting in their armchairs doing the Nielsen ratings, right?
Sure.
So it just appears that, yeah, this was a problem for a lot of things. Neil Adams and Denny O'Neill's Green Lantern book, one of my favorite comics of all time, also canceled for low sales. So it won the Shazam Award for Best Comic, and then was canceled about the time that they accepted the award because no one was buying it.
Ouch. That sucks.
So, yeah, people were not looking for necessarily, the highest quality entertainment. They were looking for other things than what maybe Siskel and Ebert types would be expecting them to at the movies, and it's the same with comics. Anyway,
I mean that Commandy that you're talking about, that actually sounds really interesting, and you're talking to somebody who's read part of Undiscovered Country. I liked The Walking Dead and some of those. I like post-apocalyptic stories and like the drama and human interaction in those worlds. I think is some of the most interesting things, and I feel like comic books specifically, I think they can do a really good job telling those kinds of stories and so this sounds really interesting. I would love to see if I could find some of those and read a couple, because
I have every issue I can borrow.
Oh my goodness. Well, because I mean, you and I have talked, and I'm not necessarily the biggest Jack Kirby fan. We tried reading the Eternals, and I didn't really follow that well. But I can see the art, and like I can see like from a high level that there's some really interesting ideas going on. It just didn't resonate with me, and I'm like I want to find something of Jack Kirby's that I'm like, okay, I get this. This is why he is thought of in such high regard, and I haven't found that yet.
Yeah, I get that. Kirby is an acquired taste. When I was young, I thought he sucked. And then there was a point, and I would bet that most people my age, snooty though they may want to be about comics, if they're honest with themselves, they thought Jack Kirby sucked before they realized he was the king. Like, if you didn't grow up in the, reading comics in the 60s, if you started reading comics in the 70s, where you're seeing art by Starlin and you're seeing art by Perez, and you've been through Neil Adams, basically, if you started comics after Neil Adams had been there, Jack Kirby looks old. And you have to kind of just realize how groundbreaking his stuff is and almost read it within context. And then it's awesome. But yeah, I think most of us, if it really comes down to it, had a phase at least when we were younger, that Jack Kirby was like, this guy's crap. So I may have to cut that out so I'm not on record saying that now. But no, it's the truth. Commandy though's fun, but also keep in mind that if you're trying to to get to like preteen and teen readers, this is basically the story of a kid and his dog, because the the scientist leader that's helping him is a dog. And then he finds a girlfriend along the way, and they make their way through this kind of crazy world with all these big adventures. So it is very much a story that, it's not like it's told through 7 different connecting magazines that you have to keep track of. He's in sort of his own pocket, a completely different universe. If you just read Commandy, that's all you need to read is Commandy. And so, yeah.
No. Right, so what else is going on?
So to get through these kind of quick, just so we can proceed to the next stuff, Ms. Magazine actually premiered this year. Gloria Steinem's sort of feminist magazine. And the first issue had Wonder Woman on the cover. But not Wonder Woman
yes.
in her ninja fighting gear or whatever. Wonder Woman in her original costume. Within a couple of months after that, DC also said, maybe the feminist thing to do is to bring Wonder Woman back as the powerful fighting force she is. And so they brought her back with her costume and her powers, and she's been that way ever since. So this year was the year that Wonder Woman returned to being Wonder Woman. We have a weird one that I just want to note. I read a book actually called Betty and Veronica by a guy named Tim Hanley, who writes just great sort of targeted histories on comics about the Archie characters. And what's interesting is he had a chapter on a guy named Al Hartley, who was a longtime Archie artist who converted to Christianity and then decided to convert everybody else, started putting all sorts of Archie or of Christian iconography and Christian stuff into the Archie comics he was doing. And because the publisher of Archie Comics was a Jewish guy, he told him, maybe knock that off. At which point Hartley quit, found somebody else and helped found something called Spire Christian Comics. And this was the year of their debut comic, something called The Cross and the Switchblade. And for years, when I was young in the 80s, if you went into like a thrift store or a used bookstore, there would be a copy or more of The Cross and the Switchblade out there. These were licensed heavily, and a lot of them were sold to churches and church organizations. So these were some of the best-selling comics of the 70s. They sold upwards of 10 million copies of these things or something like that. So, tons of them out there. But kind of interesting because they actually licensed the actual Archie characters at some point, and the covers look similar. So if you're ever reading an old Archie comic and you're like, wow, this is really preachy, check to find out if it's an Archie comic or for some reason if it's a Spire comic. It'll have the little Spire logo on it. The other thing, just as a note, most people have heard of Mouse. A lot of people, I think of that as like an 80s or 90s thing, like a graphic novel type of production. But the first episode of Mouse, the first pages of Mouse, actually were published in 1972 in an anthology comic, like an underground comic, called Funny Animals. So you've heard of Mouse?
I have heard of that. That is considered to be like a really, really good comic, and it has like some really interesting stories behind it and that sort of thing.
It is a really good comic.
Yeah.
It's a story of essentially Spiegelman's attempt to come to terms with his family's experiences during the Holocaust and his own fractured relationship with his father that sort of comes out of his father's inability to deal with some of the stuff that's happened to their family. And so it's deeply autobiographical. It's fantastic. And a lot of people, though, think of it like in terms of Watchmen and Mouse being these sort of late 80s masterpieces that sort of bring comics to a new level. But in actual fact, he's already making it way back in 72. It just took him forever to get the thing done. And then once it was done in all these small installments, it got packaged up and then became a book. And that's how people started to consume it. Because, of course, any of these comics, small print runs, only available in certain locations. Not many people would have had access to it back then. Right. Some other things, you've got like Trina Robbins' women's comics came out this year. That was partly a reaction by Robbins, who'd been working with the small press and underground scene for a while, to the fact that a lot of the underground books had sort of themes and artwork and elements of them that were just deeply so chauvinistic, often actually just flat out violent towards women. And it led to her essentially saying that Underground comics were, in fact, hostile to women. I think there's really no doubt that a lot of this is true, that a lot of these comics now are difficult to read in their context. Now, that's partly because there were no editors on them. There were no filters, and half the time the people making them were insanely high. And so because of that, bad things could get put on paper. The other thing is, one of the Underground heroes, Robert Crumb, actually got so angry at the Fritz the Cat film, which was actually one of those films that was one of the highest grossing films of 72, or of 71, that he killed his own creation, Fritz the Cat, in one of his comics this year to protest the movie. So, there you go. R.I.P. Fritz. And then, last thing to note, in case you're an action figure fan, the first real superhero action figure line came out this year with Mego Toys bringing out the world's greatest superheroes line, which started with Superman, Batman, Robert, and Aquaman. Everybody thought that, Dolls for Boys was going to be the dumbest idea ever, and this would crash. It turned out Dolls for Boys is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and so every year after this, they would then, for the next decade or so, add on more figures, and then that eventually just morphed into different kinds of figures and everything else, up to today's McFarlane toys and everything else, where you can pay God knows how many hundreds of dollars for your fully posable 27-inch tall Wonder Woman figure or something like this, if you'd like. So
hard to believe they ever thought that was going to be a bad idea, because they're just so popular now that it just. But I suppose there was a time where there was probably a thought that maybe this wasn't going to work out, but they at least tested the waters a little bit with some big name superheroes and got the ball rolling.
Yeah, the guy evidently had to take it to like 5 or 6 different toy companies because a number of them refused him. They said that and this is a guy who'd been in the business for a while, and they're like, "No, this will never work." And Mego was one of the smaller houses. He ended up on their door, and it worked out pretty well for him. So,
all right. So we have some different awards that you have listed here. There's more than one.
So I just put some in. Yeah, I put some in just to note that they are starting to not only track awards for the big companies, but you've now got these Goethe Awards that are done by the Buyer's Guide to Comics Fandom that list things like, favorite fan magazine, favorite fan artist, all of that sort of stuff. But when we really look at it, it's still a matter of right now, Jack Kirby's New Gods stuff, Adams and O'Neill's Green Lantern are super popular. The Swamp Thing book by Ween and Wrightson is huge. Tarzan, which was rebooted by DC, actually it starts with issue 207, but it was rebooted by DC and Joe Kubert took it over. And this is like a love affair project for Joe Kubert. He'd always really admired the people who did Tarzan and some of these others back in the day. And so he went back and reread all the books, redid everything. And the first few issues of DC's Tarzan, first however many, are just fantastic. Those Kubert Tarzan books are really, really well done. And Joe Kubert is a master of comics art. I mean, he literally started a school to teach people how to be comic book artists. So the man knew his business. And these were really, really some of the things that he put the most of his blood and tears into. And then the Avengers with the Kree Skull War, that was all good stuff. So there's a bunch of things there. We also had the Shazam Awards again, where Swamp Thing wins. In fact, it won most of the stuff. House of Mystery, actually, from DC, won some awards, including one for The Demon Within by John Albano and Jim Aparo, that is just a really freaky story. Like,
Okay.
it's like the code comes out and says you can do things that are a little bit sketchier, and DC just goes, "How about this?" And it's basically this murderous child and just one of the freakiest stories you'll ever see. And
Oh my
so,
goodness.
yeah, it's crazy, but we still got a couple more years of the Shazam Awards, but for the most part, DC still retains its stranglehold kind of on a lot of the awards, even as Marvel is now starting to pull ahead in some other things. That's about where we're at this year as far as comics overall.
All right. Now that we've looked at the big picture of comics, why don't we dig down a little bit and talk about the year at Marvel? The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, 1972 for Marvel. What is going on here? I'm looking at the sheet, and it seems like there's a lot of titles here.
Yeah, you see all of those little red number ones? Every one of those is a first issue.
Oh, wow.
So if we look at new titles, I'm just going to read them to let it settle in, and then we'll deal with them. We had Supernatural Chillers, Chamber of Chills, Combat Kelly, Werewolf by Night, Cat, Journey into Mystery, Volume 2, Defenders, Night Nurse, Hero for Hire, Red Wolf, Chamber of Darkness Special Edition, Marvel Triple Action, Jungle Action, Marvel Team Up, Warlock, Gunhawks, Marvel Premiere, Captain Marvel, returning, but leaving the numbering, so it's like 22 or something, and Tomb of Dracula.
That's quite a few titles.
Yeah. And so what's going on here is, after last year, where Marvel was able to sort of get in DC's way by bringing their prices down while Marvel was stuck at a higher price point, they evidently decided to simply shiv them while they were already down, right?
Oh, man.
So according to what a number of people have sort of said, Marvel's like, we want to take over newsstand space. We think we can get there because DC's stuck at this higher price point and retailers are angry at them anyways. So they flooded the market with new titles.
Oh, yeah.
Now, a number of other companies similarly saw DC, or some other companies had some weakness, and so they were doing the same. So there were a number of new titles at other companies too. DC did not bring out a bunch of new titles because they were just trying to figure out their whole 25-cent reprint thing. You know, they had some new ones, but they got rid of some and the like. So you've got something like almost 15 to 20 new titles here, most of them with actual new material. A few of them are reprints. But the crazy thing is, you know, like Supernatural Thrillers, that one comes out with adaptations of some classic, like horror stories and the like, as well as some reprints. It reprinted a Theodore Spurgeon story. Chamber of Chills comes out and reprints a Harlan Ellison story and does some adaptations of other stuff. You've got Combat Kelly, which brings back some 1950s Western or war heroes. They evidently thought the sales on Fury was good enough that they could have another war title. So even in what you'd think would be an anti-war sort of environment, they brought them back. Combat Kelly is definitely not a pro-war book. It is a very dark kind of look at combat. And in fact, I think, well, we can talk about it probably next year, because it will be next year by the time it ends. But the end of that actually involves basically the entire unit dying.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's
So,
dark.
Yeah, so that ends that one at that point, right? We had Werewolf by Night start out. We know Werewolf by Night from our Moon Knight days, right? So he got his start in a book last year, and now the interest on that was good enough that they gave him his own comic, and he gets a #1, and that will continue for quite a long time. One of the things that helped there was they got a guy named Mike Plug to do the art on the first ones, and Plug is an absolute just genius. One of the cool things about him too is he was a Will Eisner sort of acolyte. He did a lot of work in Eisner's studio. So he was one of the few people of the time coming into comics who didn't look like he'd spent all of his time copying Neil Adams or copying Jack Kirby, because that's what almost everybody else had done, right?
Okay.
And so, but he had a really great, almost like a 1950s EC style that worked tremendously for the horror stuff. You got The Cat, which is a new book featuring a female hero. Interesting thing about The Cat, Greer Nelson, you may recognize that name, because she eventually ended up undergoing this weird transformation into a actual feline woman and turning into Tigra. But for now, she is just the Cat, kind of a superhero. So this is the first, or this year has the first female superhero titles with their own book in the Marvel Universe. Greer's one of them. So the one of the people hanging around the Midnight Mansion these days was actually one of Marvel's first full-on superheroes, or female superheroes to get their own title. We've got Journey into Mystery, which is another one of those adaptations for horror. You got the Defenders getting their own book after getting that try last time. Night Nurse is another one that gets her own book. This is a weird try of, they take more like a romance, but it also sort of is obvious that it lives in the Marvel Universe. There's also 3 night nurses, so don't get them confused. You have Linda Carter, who's the one in this, and that's not the Linda Carter who becomes Wonder Woman, because that's Lynda, right? But so
right.
Linda Carter is the first one. Christine Palmer is the version of the night nurse that appears in the Doctor Strange movie.
Yes.
And then Claire Temple is the one that appears in the Daredevil television show.
That's right. Yes.
So, and all of them end up basically serving the role of the night nurse, which, as they've taken pains to note to us, she doesn't remain a nurse the entire time. She's actually a full-on trained doctor for most of it. She just likes the name, so she keeps it. So,
yeah. I remember we read some Doctor Strange books, and I remember the Palmer character, and I remember that being a different night nurse than the one from the Daredevil TV show.
Yeah, there have been a number of iterations of it for reasons only Marvel can explain. We also get the first issue of Luke Cage, huge new hero in the Marvel Universe. There had been a movie called Shaft that most of us have probably remembered, theme from Shaft and stuff like this. The blaxploitation movies were kind of a going thing at the time, and so Stan Lee wanted to have a hero that sort of fit in that sort of genre, and they came up with that, brought out Luke Cage, and he's been a successful part of the Marvel Universe ever since. There's all sorts of, tropes and stereotypes and things like that go on in Luke Cage early on. But on the other hand, he also finds his way around them. At a certain point, they started finding better authors to write the book, and it really helped. Also, of course, he starts teaming up with Danny Rand, and you get the Iron Fist along with him sometime soon. So this Luke Cage book, Hero for Hire, will eventually metamorphize into other things as it goes along, too. Red Wolf, this is another Western. It's actually an old Western Native American hero who has a wolf. So you could technically wonder whether the book is called Red Wolf because of the hero or because of his cool companion, because they're both Red Wolf. But in any case, Marvel Triple Action was reprints. Jungle Action is actually reprints as well of old sort of like Jungle Girl stories from the 50s. So that was another one that if they didn't have enough people around to do new stuff, they just threw out whatever just to mess with people, I guess. Most of these books did not last a long time, the ones that were just reprint only. Marvel Team Up does stick around. That is actually the one where Spider-Man and a guest star each month solve some sort of case or get together and have an adventure. Starts out with Human Torch. Rumors are that the idea was that sometimes it would be Spidey and the Human Torch, sometimes it would be Spidey and someone else, sometimes it would be Human Torch and someone else, but it ends up just being Spider-Man, and then usually either 1 or 2 issues with any other hero from the Marvel Universe and then return. So this then became the second Spider-Man title, which, since Spidey was as popular as he was, Stan Lee wanted to get out another book that could sort of capitalize on that. And it worked. Absolutely worked. Warlock comes out. This was spun out of Marvel Premiere. This is actually Roy Thomas and Gil Kane. We've read these books because I had you read these back when we were getting ready for some of the movie stuff. And this is that whole story of the High Evolutionary and how he creates a perfect Earth completely on the other side of the sun, the Counter Earth. And then everything's going well, and Adam Warlock's supposed to protect this planet, but then, unfortunately, evil gets in. And so High Evolutionary's like, sorry, gonna just kill this planet and start over.
Reset and start again, yeah.
And he's like, no, I don't want to do that. Warlock, goes down and saves the planet, and it's very Christ-like. This is going to last for a little while, but Warlock doesn't really take off until Starlin comes in. That's going to be a few years. So for now, it's just kind of getting geared up. And then Tomb of Dracula #1. Again, this is written at the start by Gerry Conway. Archie Goodwin comes in. Gardner Fox comes in. I think each of them does like 2 issues. They're pretty good. But it's not going to be until next year with issue #7 that Marv Wolfman takes over. And then this becomes the book that is like, Tomb of Dracula. Because at that point, the same 3 guys, basically, 4 guys, because I think the letterer remains the same too, are just going to be on this for like 7 years or something like that. So.
Okay.
But so those are the new books that came out.
So that must mean we've got a bunch of new, characters here as well.
There's a bunch of new characters. Now, Adam Warlock used to just be called him, but this is the year he gets the name Adam Warlock. Luke Cage premiered. Diamondback premiered as well. He's a primary villain for Luke Cage. He was in if you watch the Luke Cage Netflix show, he's actually in the Netflix show. That Diamondback's the guy he fights against at the very end in the big fight. Dracula, there's Dragonlord who comes in Submariner. We get Damon Tran in Daredevil.
Yes, we're going to talk about him.
Stuff.
Yeah.
Elric of Melbione gets his first show in the Marvel Universe in Conan the Barbarian #15. Now, what's interesting is Elric is actually a character who's Michael Moorcock's character, so he's not copyrighted by Marvel. They licensed him to be used in the Conan books.
That's right.
This was his actual first appearance. Also, we get Kulan Gath, who's a Conan villain. Johnny Blaze as Ghost Rider, debuted in Marvel Spotlight #5. Hammerhead comes out as a Spider-Man villain this year. We get Mr. Fear in Mighty Thor. The Night Nurse, of course. Thundra comes out in Fantastic Four #129. I always thought she was kind of a cool character. Tigra, we get her in The Cat. Rachel Helsing and Frank Drake and all the other characters, the main early ones from Tomb of Dracula, we get this year. And then Werewolf by Night, of course. Marvel Spotlight #2. There's a bunch of other smaller characters, but to be quite frank, there's so many big ones this year. I don't want to go into everybody. This was a busy year. We've had some years where I'm like, here's the person who dated this character for 2 weeks or something like that, because we didn't have that much to talk about. This is not one of those years. So.
Yeah, no, these are some very, very well-known characters, even for, I think if you polled just average people, they would know who a lot of these characters are.
Well, you have at least 4 of them who have had a movie or a television show.
Yeah.
Because Werewolf by Night, Luke Cage, Adam Warlock, and Ghost Rider. I guess Adam Warlock hasn't actually technically, but I almost equate him to the Infinity Stones at this point. But
well, he's in.
But yeah, Warlock technically has
at least 2 movies, so
he's been in them. But I mean, at that, Diamondback's been in movies and but so 3 of them have actually headlined Marvel projects,
sure.
And then others have been in them. So it's pretty impressive list of characters for late stage Marvel. So yeah.
All right. So what about big moments? Did we get any big moments in the comics or around all these comics debuting?
Again, I have to sort of just go with the big ones because there are too many of them. We're not going to talk about, things like who's getting married or whatever. Things off the list are like, Bruce Banner's ex-fiancée gets married this year to somebody else, right? Those sorts of events I'm not going to bother with because the things we've got are Marvel outsells DC for the first time. This was pretty big to them.
That's pretty big, yeah.
So these 2 companies have been sort of in a little Cold War for quite a long time. And there's been a lot of comic companies in America. But over the last few years, it seems like more and more the power in the industry is settling in these 2. And they've been bought up by large conglomerates, which give them a little bit more power, but also make them a little bit more profit hungry. So they're starting to squeeze margins and they're starting to expand their lines and they're starting to come more into direct competition. And with the either accident or trick that allowed Marvel to be 5 cents cheaper for the last 6 to 8 months, Marvel Comics actually outsells DC Comics in 1972, a lead that they would not relinquish for a long, long time. There is a point DC came back and outsold them, I believe, but it's going to be a while before we're going to see that. Marvel is now the dominant sales force in superhero comics for a long, long time. Marvel begins its UK division, and Marvel UK has been a very important part of the company, not just because it is something that's been a profit center, but because there are so many great creators who came over from the UK. And if you look at when Gaiman and, Moore and all of these guys were getting their start, they were reading Marvel comics that were coming over through the Marvel UK contracts when they were 10 years old, when they were 15 years old. And then,
that makes sense.
When they get to America, they are fully up on superhero comics and then go over to DC and make, the best stuff in the world. And some of them, Alan Davis, a few others come over and hang, but Marvel and Moore never had a very good relationship. And, of course, Marvel and DC didn't have a particularly good relationship by the end either. So that's the way that goes. But I think it was important that Marvel UK began this year. Stan's soapbox becomes a regular feature in comics. He'd been having places where he would do blurbs already. Like we'd seen a number of those over the years.
Yeah.
But this is the point now where he actually is every month inserting his own little message into all of the comics. Part of the reason for this might be that this is the year Stan becomes Marvel's publisher and actually takes a hands-off approach and gives Roy Thomas the title of Marvel Editor-in-Chief, meaning that day-to-day Stan no longer has any oversight over actually getting the comics made. He's just sort of the figurehead, the publisher, the one that's dealing with those higher-end business deals. So what has happened here is when the elder Goodman, the one who Stan had worked for decades, left the company after selling it to the new ownership, one of the things he had demanded was that his son Chip would be brought on as publisher. As is often the case, people's sons who need, their dad to get them jobs are not necessarily the best people for those jobs, right?
Sure.
So Stan actually negotiated some sort of a thing where he said, look, I'm going to leave and go do something else. If I have to keep working for Chip, I just want his job and I'll stay here and we'll keep making things better. And they said, yeah, that sounds good. And they fired Chip Goodman, and they made Stan publisher, and then he had to then give duties over to somebody else. And so Stan actually first split it up between 3 guys, and that evidently worked about as well as like Caesar splitting up his empire into 3 parts. And so eventually everything was going to heck, and he said, all right, I'm going to have to do something about this. And he made Thomas the actual editor-in-chief and gave him control. And
Makes
so,
sense.
yep. And then there were a couple of other sort of smaller things. I do think one of the more interesting things of this year is that in the 1950s, there had been a bunch of Captain America comics, because Cap had been published well up into the 50s, where he turned into almost like a, the Joe McCarthy type, right? Where he's like,
yes.
I've got a list of names and the like.
Uh-huh.
And Marvel was uncomfortable with the fact that their hero had that backstory. And so they came up with a new one, saying that in the 50s, when Cap was in the ice, somebody else rediscovered the formula, took it, found somebody who was kind of like Bucky, gave them the serum, and then those two, who'd made the serum not quite right, so it drove them a little nuts, turned into the Cap and Bucky of the 50s, who were the ones who were the McCarthyites, and they were later sort of defeated, and that is why there were terrible Cap and Bucky for a while. It wasn't really Cap. He was stuck in the ice.
Sure.
And it was these doofuses who were being driven mad by bad serum.
Wow.
Which they would have never bothered with, but as continuity becomes more of a thing and people start asking questions, you get these weird answers. So,
right. No, that makes sense. Okay. So on that note, let's move on and let's talk about who's in the bullpen here. And with Stan Lee going into the publisher role, anointing Roy Thomas as editor-in-chief, that's probably going to have some mix, or that's going to have some cascading effects throughout the rest of the bullpen, I would imagine.
It really does. Gerry Conway actually is now your most prolific writer in the bullpen with 57 credits for the year.
And he's like 19 or 20, right? At this point?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yep. But yeah, these guys are all young at this point. Roy Thomas has 55. Steve Englehart comes in and has 18 credits. Archie Goodwin wrote 17 books. And Stan Lee still kicks in with 17. And most of those are going to be like some Thor and Spider-Man and stuff like that. Books that he has just not wanted to give up. So, penciler, we've got John Buscema, 31 credits. He always worked pretty quickly, but that's still, when you talk about it, that's a lot of art. Now, some of those are smaller stories for anthology books. A lot of these guys are doing some of them now. Gene Colan with 20, Barry Windsor Smith 16, Herb Trumpy and Gil Kane rounded out. So those are the top 5 pencilers. There's only 4 really big inkers: Vince Coletta, Joe Sinnott, Tom Palmer, and Frank Giacoca. I cannot pronounce that guy's name. Colorist, Tom Palmer is credited with 16, Barry Windsor Smith 7, Mimi Gold 7, Marie Severin 5. So, and then George Russo's 3, and that's the whole list. Which means, again, with like writer and penciler, there's 20 other people with 5 to 10 of them. So there's dozens or hundreds of coloring credits missing.
Sure.
Letterer, we got 77 for John Costanza, 59 for Artie Simic, 43 for Sam Rosen, and 10 for Gene Simic. So you see Costanza comes in, and immediately the younger guy is top of the heap.
Lettering everything. A lot of things, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So total, there were 96 creators who were titled or who were credited on some part of a Marvel Universe book for Marvel in as far as the inside story in 1972, which is more than we've seen before by quite a lot.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the new people here and our Rookie of the Year.
Sure. So, again, as many times, I'm gonna go with an honorable mention. Michael Moorcock, who is a novelist and has done a lot of great stuff in like fantasy, actually wrote the Elric novels, licensed the character to Marvel, but also did collaborate with Roy Thomas on the actual story for the Conan book. So he is actually credited, and it's not just a, hey, we stole his ideas. This was actually, Moorcock actually did collaborate in the ideas of how these would be done. And then evidently, Barry Windsor Smith and him talked afterwards, and he had to apologize for giving him a funny hat because Moorcock was like, I hate that hat you put on Elric, and that sort of stuff. So he was there, but he did very little work for them. Nonetheless, another one of those, very well-known, very talented people that Marvel was happy to have their name in their books. Sure. As far as the people who we're going to actually have for Rookie of the Year, this is one of those years I have to give apologies, because among the names that don't even make the top 3 or top 4 are Mike Ploog, P. Craig Russell, Ernie Chan, Don Perlin, Rich Buckler, Val Mayerick, Billy Graham. A lot of these guys are fantastic artists.
I've heard of those, like Don Perlin specifically, and we've read books with him on art.
Yep, absolutely. He did a bunch of stuff. He's done a lot of Iron Man and stuff I like. Rich Buckler is one of my favorite artists of the 70s and 80s. Same with Val Mayerick. Billy Graham, we've read some of his stuff. He did a lot of things on Black Panther, some of the Jungle Action books we read. Ernie Chan has just a really fantastic style that I loved a lot of his DC stuff in the 70s. P. Craig Russell's done a lot of work with Neil Gaiman and has a really fantastic, just almost ethereal sort of style that is like nothing else. P. Craig Russell is just like an art style unto himself. He looks like nothing else. Mike Ploog, similarly talked about, really a talented artist. But in terms of actual long-term effect on Marvel Comics and on comics as a whole, we've got 4 people I'd like to note. And going, I guess, in inverse order, Steve Gerber. Actually, he wrote over 600 things for Marvel. He created Howard the Duck, or co-created Howard the Duck. He is one of the best Marvel writers of the 70s and early 80s. He left us way too early, so because of that, we didn't get a late-stage career from him. But the stuff he did was fantastic. There's actually a book that I read a while ago called Marvel Comics in the 1970s by a guy named Elliot Borenstein. And one of the chapters in there is called Subjectivity and Its Discontents. And it is about Gerber and some of the stuff he wrote during the 70s. It's fantastic. Another person who obviously could have been considered is Dave Cockrum. Cockrum is a really good artist. He also did a lot of writing. He helped to co-create the new X-Men. And by doing that, obviously ushered in a group of characters that was going to basically define Marvel for most of the 80s, right? So he's somebody who's done a lot of other work. I really loved his work on Legion of Superheroes. That's actually probably my favorite Dave Cockrum work. So he's been around at both companies, did a lot of stuff. Steve Englehart had, again, probably like 400 and some Marvel credits. He also did a lot of stuff, mostly at DC, with a guy named Marshall Rogers. The Englehart Rogers, Mr. Miracle, and Batman are some of my favorite comics of the late 70s. Englehart had long runs on Avengers, long runs on all sorts of other Marvel books. He is somebody who wrote Cap really well, like Captain America, wrote Doctor Strange really well. He would be a really good choice for Rookie of the Year as well.
Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised, actually, that he's not in the Comic Book Hall of Fame, as far as I can tell, because I would think he should be there by now. But
so, if all of these people are not our Rookie of the Year for 1972, who is the Rookie of the Year for 1972?
Well, Jim Starlin made his first appearance, which means it's kind of a moot point.
Oh, yes.
Because the thing about Starlin is he not only has been with Marvel for a long time, because he's been creating stuff for years. He also creates stuff on his own. He did a story called Dreadstar that I've been following for decades now that I really enjoy. But he co-created characters like Drax and Thanos and Gamora and Nebula. He co-created Shang-Chi. And he wrote all of the Infinity Gauntlet stories and the Infinity, assorted stories that essentially the MCU built toward and is based on. Yeah. So in terms of somebody who's important to the Marvel future, right? There are very few people who've made Marvel as much coin as Jim Starlin.
Yeah. He's got a really, really just... I don't know the right word to describe his art style, but his art style is unlike anything else.
Yes, I think of it as being very angular and also kind of psychedelic. He's got a style where in some ways it almost seems like most of his people are drawn as though they're sort of bones with clothes on.
Right.
He stretches everybody out kind of, and there's this tension, and it is unlike anything else. It's also fantastic. I've always loved Starlin's art style. It's another reason why he's such a good candidate for being sort of someone to celebrate is. So there were books like, Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War, Infinity Crusade. He didn't draw all of them, but he wrote all of them. And then early on, he's drawing all of this stuff from Warlock and a lot of those. He ended up writing and drawing a lot of his Dreadstar stuff. Just a very talented dude.
So does he end up primarily be doing a lot of the Marvel cosmic stuff? Because it does seem like a lot of those characters are from the cosmic universe of Marvel, and some of this other things that I recall seeing his name attached to. A lot of it seems like cosmic stuff.
I think it's reasonable to say that he, in many ways, is the godfather of the Marvel Cosmic Universe.
Okay, yeah.
He can't be the father because that would be Jack Kirby.
Right, that makes sense.
He made the Silver Surfer and Galactus and got the whole thing started. But in terms of getting it going and really developing the Marvel Universe off planet, even when he did make cosmic characters, for the most part, outside of some of the stuff he did in Thor and the like, Kirby kept most of his focus on Earth, whereas a lot of the characters Starlin focused on never even came to Earth except incidentally. They were truly living out in the cosmos. And so it was, but even later on, he wrote and drew the Death of Captain Marvel graphic novel, which is sort of not only is it the first Marvel graphic novel, so that's a kind of a landmark in and of itself, but also with Captain Marvel then being a cosmic character, he's the one they brought in to sort of close off that career as well, because Starlin had been associated with Captain Marvel quite a lot as well. So there's a few cosmic characters like Nova that I don't think of him with, but most cosmic characters in the Marvel Universe, Starlin's gonna have left a significant imprint on them. Yeah.
That definitely sounds like a Rookie of the Year to me.
Yep. He also was inaugurated into the Hall of Fame, the Eisner Hall of Fame in 2017. So he's the only one of the rookies this year that has so far gotten into the Hall of Fame. But even outside that, I think just the fact that not only did he do such great work, but that work has then been built on in such fundamental ways in the things that Marvel has done in the future.
Influential to everything that has come after it,
Yep.
Definitely. All right, I think that's a great Rookie of the Year, Jim Starlin for 1972. But with that, are we ready to talk some Daredevil?
Always ready to talk Daredevil.
Year in Daredevil.
All right, Dwayne. So, finished up with all of that. This now brings us to the focus of our little podcast, talking about the Man Without Fear. Looks like this week you're going to be talking about Daredevil number 83 to 94 and Incredible Hulk 152 and 153. So,
yes,
what do you got for us?
Those were Matt Murdock's appearances for this year. This kind of year in review is going to primarily focus on the Daredevil books themselves. We will mention a little bit about what happens in the Incredible Hulk books, but we'll start it off by talking about Gerry Conway, because he wrote most of these issues, and Gene Colan again returns for another year on art. Stan Lee starts as the editor as we begin 1972, but Roy Thomas takes over in issue 91. But Stan Lee's name is not completely removed from the books. His name is still mentioned in each issue as presenting Daredevil, the Man Without Fear, and so he's still got his name on the books as you would expect. Apart from those three gentlemen, Alan Weiss, Barry Windsor Smith did art on one of the books, issue number 83, that first book of the year. But these are guys we're used to. We saw Gerry Conway for most of last year. Gene Colan's been a mainstay when it comes to the art in Daredevil for quite some time. So this feels like the last couple years, right? And the year starts with Daredevil trying to convince Black Widow to trust the police and his friend, the district attorney. And when she does, she ultimately ends up going to prison. The case then gets dismissed against her because the body of Scorpion, who some passerby claimed that she murdered in cold blood, the Scorpion, that body was lost in an explosion during a battle between Daredevil and Mr. Hyde.
Awkward. Now,
I would point out, I should note that we're not actually sure if there was a body to be found. There was a body that was taken of Scorpion's. It was brought to the morgue, but at the morgue, it ended up being Dr. Hyde. And we never actually see a Scorpion body. And so then there was this big fight. Daredevil confronts him because he's basically checking to see if there is a body. It ends up being Mr. Hyde. They fight. The morgue blows up. And ultimately, Natasha's case gets dismissed. So really kind of weird sort of ending to this story. But it is, I guess, what it is. So as we move on, the plot that we found out about last year with Foggy Nelson getting blackmailed by Mr. Klein ends up causing him to resign as district attorney. Yet it's weird because he sort of kind of ends up remaining district attorney later on in the year and in the future. So I'm not entirely sure what happens there. Do you have any idea, Dan?
I'm not really exactly sure how. No, it seems like maybe that he just sort of ended up being able to get away with it because Klein disappeared and then it went back. I don't know.
Yeah, it is really weird because he talks about the fact that he is going to resign, or that he has resigned, and then all of a sudden he's still sort of in that district attorney role. So
yeah, I mean, there's a point where I know that Foggy says he's got to resign, and then Matt's like, no, you got to rebuild. But I don't know. Did he resign?
Maybe he didn't actually resign. Maybe he said he was going to and then didn't actually do it. Because in the Hulk books that are coming out early in the year, Matt Murdock actually represents Bruce Banner and ends up going to trial against Foggy Nelson, no less, over Bruce Banner. And during his representation of Bruce Banner, he ends up angering the Hulk, who thinks that Murdock is not choosing, or not basically siding with the Hulk, and he doesn't. Hulk isn't really one to know nuance and that sort of thing. And Matt's actually trying to follow Bruce Banner's wishes, and they kind of don't really jive with what the Hulk wants. And there's all this about a fair trial. It's interesting that, like, these Hulk books, 152, 153, we actually see a lot of Matt Murdock, the lawyer, as opposed to Daredevil, the man without fear. And it was really interesting that we got to see so much of Matt Murdock in here. And you know, you counter that with the Daredevil title, and we see Matt Murdock doing very little lawyering in his own book.
And I think that's because it makes sense that when he's a guest star, he just fulfills a different role. Right. There's not a lot of room in the Hulk for more hero, because Hulk is all the hero you need in that book, right? So
that makes sense.
Come in and I think that makes sense. I mean, obviously could have done it another way, but if you make Daredevil a book where there's too much of Matt Murdock as the lawyer, the Marvel sort of demand that there's action on every page is difficult to do, because
Matt Murdock isn't necessarily going to be punching people and swinging from a billy club throughout the city and that sort of thing. So. All right, back in the Daredevil titles, we see Black Widow head off to Switzerland to meet with a doctor who says they can restore the sight to the blind. She then reaches out to Murdock in New York, who heads there only to find out that this doctor is in fact none other than Mr. Klein, MK9, the assassin, whatever you want to call this android. We learn that the android is a being known as Baal. Is that how that's pronounced?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. From the future, who's traveled back in time to stop the end of humanity. And so there ends up being this big confrontation over in Switzerland. And it actually ends when two executioners from Baal's time arrive and end up killing him during that confrontation with Natasha and Matt Murdock. So it was this big climactic battle. They start fighting. These executioners show up and basically end it right quick. It was this build up for several issues, and then it kind of ends pretty fast without our heroes really doing much of anything.
So I'm going to ask a quick question before I say something.
Okay.
Do these guys come back in the next few issues?
No, they're just gone.
So
the executioners are just...
Right, so here comes my question. So one thing maybe you got that I didn't, but as they're going, it almost sounds like the folks who come the second time believe that somehow it's important that Black Widow and Daredevil are there, and somehow they're going to like ensure the future, right? Because they're like, go off and enjoy your lives.
Yeah, yes. So it seems like this Baal character thought that Daredevil and Natasha were like the reason humanity ends, and then these executioners show up, they take care of him, and are just like, okay, you two can go about your business. You're fine.
But I mean, the crazy thing is that almost implies that yes, they are the reason that humanity ends, because the executioners are robots too, aren't they? It's like,
yes,
it's just like, yeah. So I mean, that's a little awkward.
It is.
I'm troubled by that. So yeah, there's a reading now, I would suspect, that says that every time that Murdock and Black Widow escape certain death in the Marvel Universe, it's because the robot overlords that are going to destroy humanity in the future need them alive to bring about the end of humanity, and so they're just interfering to keep them safe.
That is one way you could read it, I suppose, yes.
Anyway, proceed.
I don't know how much I want to lend credence to that, but it's like there's definitely a way that you could read it like that. So, okay. After that, Daredevil and Black Widow, coming back to the U.S., end up taking on the Gladiator, who is on their flight, and ends up hijacking the plane. They're able to defeat him and his accomplices without much trouble, and Daredevil, because he can, ends up landing the plane back in New York. Because we know it. He has the ability of landing planes despite the fact that, he's blind and all.
And not a trained pilot. Which is also, you'd think,
sure,
a problem.
If you're going to nitpick.
I will say, the plane was crazy. Like, it's basically, people are sitting around on couches and relaxing, and it's definitely not economy class on a modern plane.
No, it is.
They're flying.
This is not the plane ride that you or I have nowadays. That's definitely not the case. So back in New York, it looks like Karen Page and her agent Phil are going to end up together in California. But upon arriving in New York, Matt runs into Karen at the airport, and the two share a kiss and an embrace, causing much heartache to both Phil as well as Natasha. So that was a really awkward situation there. You have Natasha and Matt Murdock, who have been kind of on again. They're kind of a thing. And then, but he's still sort of pining after Karen a little bit. And then she and Phil got together, like we talked about last week. And they're going to the airport. And then they're getting off their plane and they see each other. And they're so happy to see each other. They basically run to each other and profess their love for one another, forgetting the fact that they were just with other people pages before,
pages before. They're with other people on the page. Literally, the other people are standing there watching them just... I mean, it's... Oh, man.
Yes.
Matthew, this will not be the last time that I just shake my head and go, really, Murdock? So, yeah. He's... And I mean, the other thing... This is not just, a woman that he's leaving to go and embrace him. He has just basically left and embarrassed and humiliated in public the Black Widow, right?
Right.
So how is he even still alive at this point? Let alone, this should be the end of the series right here, you'd think. But
yes, probably.
In any case, that was weird.
Yes. Next, Daredevil takes on the Ox, who is a character that we've seen before after his release from prison. And during the battle, the Ox's radiation builds up to the point where he explodes. So there was a little bit of a fight, and ultimately Daredevil's actually trying to help him more than really fight him. And the radiation that made the Ox is building up to the point where he actually explodes and ends up dying. And so there's really not much of a fight, actually. It just sort of ends. And then after the battle, Karen admits to Matt that she still cannot handle him being Daredevil and leaves him to return to L.A. Matt then rekindles his romance with the Black Widow, and the two move to San Francisco. So we go from the East Coast to the West Coast as the series continues, which is really weird. I was not expecting them to pick up and move to San Francisco. Well, first off, I guess that Natasha would take him back after so publicly being kind of humiliated in the book before, and then they're going off and living in a mansion in San Francisco, and then fun tales and things
not even
happen
just takes
there.
him back. He walks the girlfriend / ex-fiance down the stairs. She takes off down the street, and Natasha is kind of standing outside her car outside the door and walks toward him. So he is without a girlfriend for something like 3.5 seconds. And,
yes,
and then
everything's back. Two panels, and I think even Karen just sort of says, "He's yours now," or something like that, practically as well too. So it is rough.
Ridiculous.
So once in San Francisco, the two end up taking on Electro, and Kilgrave separately before those two team up in an effort to take down Daredevil, none of which actually works. That team up book that I mentioned is actually going to be our spotlight issue this week. So I thought it would be fun to look at that. So we will look at that in more detail in just a little bit. Next, Black Widow talks about Danny French and the Project 4 from her past with Daredevil and Ivan Petrovich, and thinks that it might be related to some bouts of fear that are causing issues with them fighting crime. Now, as it turns out, that those bouts of fear are actually from a new Mr. Fear, whom Daredevil confronts and takes down at Jason Sloan's law office, who is recruiting him to be a lawyer at their law firm. Now that he's living out in San Francisco, the Matt Murdock needs a job so that Daredevil can go off and do Daredevil things.
Mm-hmm.
So, issue 92 is actually a really big issue because the cover of the book actually changes. The name of the title is now Daredevil and the Black Widow, and it would remain that way through the rest of the year and into 1973. So this is.
I left that off of my list of new books just so you could have the surprise. By the way, so there you go.
There you go.
Surprise, everyone! That was one more new book.
It kept the numbering, so issue 92 is still issue 92. It's not a new number 1 or anything like that, but it is literally Daredevil and the Black Widow. It's got a picture, like little pictures of both of them on the cover, and it's definitely, they're co-headlining the book now. It really does feel like that the Black Widow is as important as Daredevil in these stories, and the fact that we end up learning about Project 4 and some of these old associates of the Black Widow, I think makes really lends to the credence of this being kind of a co-titled book. So the year ends with Daredevil and Black Widow taking on Indestructible Man, who is also after the Project 4 sphere. So the Project 4 is this sphere that has like this immense power associated with it. Indestructible Man, by the way, is that Damon Dran character that Dan mentioned a little bit earlier. The final battle over the sphere, and that with Indestructible Man, goes rather poorly. He's basically indestructible and nobody can do anything to him, neither the Widow nor Daredevil, until Danny French ends up throwing a spear at the glove that's providing Damon Dran's powers. The resulting explosion destroys Dran's powers and seemingly kills Dran in the process. However, the victory comes at a cost. Danny bore the brunt of the explosion and ends up dying in Black Widow's arms, with Daredevil looking on. And so, like, the last panel is literally a dying Danny in Black Widow's arms as Daredevil is looking over them. So that is the year of Daredevil in 1972.
Very cool. Nicely done.
All right, let's talk. Go ahead.
So I wanted to actually just ask, did you notice the art over the course of this just really solidify? Because to me, I love the art in these books as opposed to the last couple of years. And it's weird because it's all been Gene Colan.
Right.
But Tom Palmer has been on the book for almost this entire year now, or maybe over the year. And he's really started to understand how to ink Gene Colan. And this is the reason why he's going to be Colan's preferred inker for like the entire run of Tomb of Dracula and stuff. He just gets him. And he uses some of the Zipatone stuff to do some of the shading. He gets the dark areas and the like and everything. And there are just so many fantastic... There's a lot of the splash panels are just beautiful. One of the ones that when they first moved to San Francisco, they're just sort of like getting out of the car, and it's this sort of, slanted road with the big house and whatever.
Yeah.
Just fantastic. And a lot of the other ones, they have some, I think one of the next issues with like 2 or 3 full-page panels of just the Black Widow and Daredevil sort of spinning around over the city through the air.
Right.
The art on these is just sublime.
Now that you mention it, there definitely is, like, I think I've really appreciated Gene Colan's art throughout all this, but to your point, it does feel like over the course of this year that it sort of goes a step further, and it definitely has a lot to do with the color choices that are being made to the original art.
Yeah, it is interesting because, of course, Colan is also learning. He's still a young guy as well and has been perfecting his craft, but he's such a different artist in the way that he does things and in the way that he works with sort of his pencils, that I think it's taken Marvel a long time to just figure out how to best reproduce on a comic page his art too, and they're starting to get it figured out. So probably, to your point of colorists, they're finding colorists who are able to actually work better with the way he's, his kind of art. They've got Palmer on him now, who understands how to do the shading properly, and it just looks great. It looks like classic top-notch Gene Colan, which doesn't get much better than.
There's 2 other things that I think also sort of help this year. One, I think Conway's like storytelling, I think, is improving as the year goes on. Like we were talking about how it felt like he was trying to do some pretty ambitious things last year, and they didn't necessarily work very well, and it felt like there was a lot of sort of just like missed opportunities where he was trying to do too much and it just didn't really work out. This whole Project 4 and how the year sort of wrapped up, it really feel like it was very well done. He sort of planted seeds. We saw Danny French very early on, and then you're like, well, what is this guy, and why is Widow so irritated or upset that he's around, and then all this sort of thing, and so I really think that has improved as the year has gone on, which made these books better. I also think San Francisco, just the change of locale for these characters, I think made for some really interesting art too, and really allowed for some creativity to happen that, we've seen all these characters in New York for a very long time, and so allowing them in a different locale with a much different look can definitely allow for some very visually interesting things that then combined with an improved storytelling can really, really make some good books.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Because, that is very true. That Conway's stories are so much improved. His dialogue's improved. Everything about the way that these books flow. They're entertaining comic books. They are definitely sometimes a little bit almost maudlin, because it is higher on the romance scale. You've got the 2 of them very much as romantic partners now as much. And because they're adventuring together as well, they get to carry the pillow talk with them out into the field as well, instead of it just being when he's back at the office talking to Karen. Now you've got it for the full 22 pages or whatever. But I didn't notice at hardly any point, and I had to go through these books relatively quickly because it's been a busy week, so I didn't spend as much time just sort of reading all the dialogue as carefully as I could. But I didn't feel at any point that it was as stilted as it was last week, where he's come through with a lot of improvement on his dialogue in the last year, which makes sense because he's been writing an awful lot of comic books.
Yes,
right? So.
Yes, he's definitely all of that practice is starting to pay off, and you're seeing improved dialogue, better storytelling, more coherence between different things happening, better able to plant seeds through books and that sort of thing. So
When you're
definitely
doing over one script a week, you're either going to get better real quick, or you're just going to lose your mind and go find another job. So,
yes.
You know.
All right, let's talk about new powers, toys, places. We have Switzerland, obviously, where Black Widow meets Mr. Klein, who's posing as the Doctor, and then San Francisco and the North Shore Mansion, where Daredevil and Black Widow are staying. She apparently rented this place with some inheritance, and so those two are living together. And then upgrades. We have a new upgrade on the Billy Club. He's actually during this year introduced a radio transmitter inside the Billy Club, and ends up using that in one of the books. So that was interesting. Beginning to wonder how all this stuff can actually fit in the Billy Club, but apparently it does. No problems.
I love how there's a guy who's kind of like an engineer on the flight in the one where they were hijacked on the plane. The guy's like, "Hey, I take a look at that," you know. And the widow's like, "Just give it back," you know. But
yeah.
I would be that guy. Like, oh, I'd be very interested to learn how this works.
Right. So. As far as new supporting characters, because we moved to San Francisco, there's definitely a few of those. We have Iron Guts O'Hare, who is the San Francisco Police Commissioner, and who is very kind of hesitant of having some new superheroes in his jurisdiction. But he seems to warm up to them a little bit as the year goes on. We have Danny French, who is an acquaintance to Black Widow from her past and working with her on this Project 4. We have Larry Cranston, who is a lawyer looking to have Murdock join his law firm. And then Jason Sloan, who is the senior partner at Cranston's law firm, who he meets and is giving him kind of the hard press to get him to join the law firm. So,
yep.
And of course, when you have some of these supporting characters, they end up actually being villains. And one of these guys ends up being the new Mr. Fear, that is Larry Cranston. He gets the costume and powers from the original Mr. Fear, Zoltan Drago, after Star Saxon killed him. So if you remember way back a few years ago, Zoltan Drago was the original Mr. Fear. Star Saxon killed him and then posed as him for a little while. And when he Cranston basically walked in on him as he was dying after Star Saxon killed him, or tried to kill him, and he hadn't quite died yet. And basically, Drago told him what the costume was and how to use it before he died, and he thought this would be something he wanted to do. So he went ahead and did this, and I don't know. It's
like you do.
like you do, yes. We have Indestructible Man, which is Damon Dran. He is a wealthy man who fears nuclear Armageddon and had originally hired Danny French and the Widow to steal the Project 4 sphere. So that's his connection to the whole Project 4, and ultimately he gets it, becomes this superhuman person, and Danny French is the one that ends up taking him down, basically. So
all right, cool.
Yeah. We had some other villains like the Ox and that we talked about during the kind of the year in review, but these were all ones that we had seen before, so, we're only going to highlight the new ones.
Yep.
All right, let's talk briefly about the Spotlight book for this week. This week's Spotlight story. All right, the Spotlight for this week, issue 89 from July 1972. Crisis in the Sky is the name of the book. It is Gerry Conway. It is Gene Colan. And as Daredevil continues to cripple the Purple Man's operation around San Francisco, Black Widow considers working with Danny French to finish their last mission, which was Project 4. Furious over Daredevil's interference in his operation's Kilgrave, learning of Electro's criminal activity in the San Francisco area, tracks down the Electric villain and the two team up to crush their mutual foe. As Matt tries to talk the Black Widow into letting him help her with her current problems, the two are attacked by the Purple Man and Electro. Daredevil battling Kilgrave in his hover ship. Daredevil forces the ship to crash. Kilgrave seemingly dies. I say seemingly, we don't see a body, so all bets are off as to whether or not he's actually dead. While Black Widow tricks Electro into battling her near lightning rods and has his powers drained, thus causing him to get knocked out and ending their team up. So, real quick spotlight this week. We've talked at great detail about some of the other stuff this week, so I wanted to go with something a little bit shorter because we've spotlighted some pretty big storylines the last few weeks, and so I wanted to go something a little quicker. I liked this book because obviously we have the return of Kilgrave, who I was happy to see. I like the character. I think it's a really interesting character and a cool adversary for Daredevil. So I was happy to see him back. I liked how even moving to San Francisco, it's like the villains don't
keep showing up.
Yeah, they all just keep showing up. It doesn't matter. He could be like setting up shop in Walla Walla, Washington or something, and then all of a sudden, oh look, it's a hotbed of villainy going on in here. And it's not just the villains, they're teaming up. It's like, well, if one of us can't do it on our own in one book and the other can't do it on their own in one book, why don't we work together and see if that works? And of course it never actually does. But so that was interesting. And then Black Widow and Daredevil battle crime together, and they do it well, but their relationship here feels entirely less great. I mean, obviously we talked about Matt basically like ditching her at the airport, and then the very next issue basically being dumped by Karen and then immediately going back to her, and her just taking him back. And like, yeah. there seems to be like, I know this is a Daredevil title, but there does sort of feel like it feels like Daredevil's still kind of the main guy, and like Black Widow has to be saved sometimes, and it sucks, especially since she's now co-headlining the title.
I think it was weird that in the book where they changed the title to Daredevil and Black Widow, I actually went and looked. She doesn't appear until page 11 of what is now her own book.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
and so they're trying. Maybe they've made a decision to do this as a team up book. But yeah, as of right now, it's obvious that it's not an equal team up, which, to be fair, does make some sense in that Daredevil was, last time we got any kind of data, the third or fourth highest selling Marvel book. And, people do still want to see their Daredevil. But if you're going to change the title to include them both, there should definitely, I think, especially in the very first book that she's got her name at the title.
Yeah.
I almost was wondering when I got to the halfway point, I'm like, so is Daredevil not in the back half now? And it's almost like a split book where they each just do their own thing.
Uh-huh.
And it's a shared story that isn't a shared story, which would have been kind of cool, actually. But that was not the case. It was a couple pages of her, and then Daredevil showed back up again, and
I don't know. It's weird, and I do hope that it improves as we go through these books. If her name's going to remain on the cover for a little while, which, spoiler, it does for a little while.
Quite a while, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's on there for a good decent time, which is cool. I am a Black Widow fan, so I've always been kind of partial to these books. Actually, I liked this part of Daredevil's run.
This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, let's talk the takeaway. What is the takeaway for 1972?
So for me, the takeaway really is pretty straightforward, and that is that non-standard business procedures sometimes actually do what you would hope them to, whether it's fair or not. Marvel has done some interesting things the last few years. They've had some luck, and it's all worked out for them. They've had luck in terms of the fact that they managed to tick off Jack Kirby, and somehow him going to the competition did not come back to bite them as badly as it could have.
Right.
They have raised prices in agreement with another company, broken that promise, and then not only had it work for them, but I mean, DC even had problems when they wanted to go down. And this is going to be a spoiler for next year, because the economy had turned so bad that the Nixon administration had put in price controls, making it impossible for people to raise or lower prices without a good reason. So DC actually wasn't able to go back down to 20 cents without talking and explaining to the government why they were doing this. Whereas Marvel had made their price change before the price controls came in. So they gained a little bit of time there too. Just in everything that's been going on here, Marvel has kind of rolled sixes repeatedly. The new people they're bringing in are doing great work. They've had sort of the right decisions at the right time for quite a few things. And now we're going to find out next year whether that means they were geniuses or they were lucky, because a lot of bad times are coming, and we'll see how all of the various comic companies deal with them. But my takeaway for this year is Marvel has had a decade-long march, and they have finally made it to the top of the superhero comic book mountain. And in fact, really the comic book mountain, I believe, as of this year. So they are the top comic book publisher in America as of now. And it's been a long time coming, and they're going to have it for a while. So congratulations, Marvel.
You did it. Great job.
You are now the one everybody's going to try to knock off the mountain. So.
Yeah. Be careful what you wish for, sort of thing. Is
Yep.
much easier being the person gunning for someone than the person they're gunning for, I would imagine.
Yep.
So, all right. I think that's a fantastic takeaway and a great way to wrap up this week.
Sounds good.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.